When someone leaves, the mind rushes to the most obvious conclusion. It's over. Silence becomes the answer, absence becomes the sentence, and everything seems too definitive to be questioned. But there is a type of departure that doesn't end the story. It only changes its rhythm. There is a type of goodbye that doesn't kill the feeling. It only pushes it to a place where it matures in silence. And that's why this question hurts as much as it reveals. Have you ever lost someone who was still alive? Someone who was breathing, continuing their own life, but left a space that no one else could fill? Because some losses don't happen in the body, they happen in time, in what was interrupted before completion. Today, this story exists to show something that almost no one accepts in the moment of pain. Some departures are necessary for love to cease being dependence and become truth. Love moves like the tide. Sometimes it recedes so much that it seems like abandonment. It seems like forgetfulness. It seems like the end of the ocean. But the ocean never goes away. He simply steps away to gain strength, to reorganize what has been messed up, to return different. And when he returns, he doesn't ask if you're ready. He simply arrives, proving that what is real doesn't disappear. It just learns the longer way back. Tell me, where in the world are you watching this story from? Staying until the end of this story changes how you see losses that still hurt. Because this isn't about convincing anyone that everything happens by chance, but about revealing something that's almost never said when someone leaves. By understanding why the one you love leaves, the guilt begins to lose its power. That feeling that you did something wrong, that if things had been different, the person would have stayed. There's a specific moment when everything seems definitive. The day the message doesn't arrive, the call doesn't happen, and silence settles in as the final answer. At that point, tears come, attempts at explanation, questions that find no echo. The mind insists on looking for a mistake, a detail, a personal failing. But time shows something different. It shows that that separation wasn't there to punish, but to teach. Some distances exist to reveal value, others to close cycles that couldn't grow that way. And there's a gain that remains even when no one returns. Peace. Peace in understanding that not every goodbye is abandonment. Some are about maturing. Some are the necessary interval for love to stop hurting and start making sense, even if the final path isn't a reunion. When he left, it wasn't because of you. It was because of himself. And that's the hardest part to accept when the pain is still fresh. There's an automatic narrative the mind creates in the face of loss. If someone left, it's because the other person wasn't enough, didn't do enough, didn't know how to love the right way. But the truth is quieter and less accusatory. People don't run away from people, they run away from internal conflicts they don't know how to face. It's like someone running out of a burning house, not because they hate the house, not because it ceased to be a shelter, but because the fire became too big to control. The problem was never the place. It was the fire. There was a specific moment when this became clear. The day when, even present, he already seemed absent. His gaze wouldn't rest, his answers were short, and there was a weariness that didn't match the situation, but something much deeper. It wasn't disinterest, it was confusion. It wasn't coldness, it was someone trying to survive an internal chaos they couldn't name. At the time, everything seemed too personal not to hurt. Then came the attempts at adjustment. The conversations that went in circles, the feeling that just a little more insistence would solve it. Only later did it become clear that some people leave not because they don't love, but because they can't sustain what they feel. They leave to breathe, even if it hurts those who stay behind. And understanding this doesn't erase the pain, but it changes the weight it carries. Because when the departure is internal, no external presence is enough to stop it. There's a silent mistake that hurts more than the departure itself, believing that true love always remains no matter the cost. This idea is repeated so many times that it becomes an emotional rule, and when reality breaks that promise, the pain comes accompanied by guilt and confusion. The romanticization of whoever loves never leaves ignores something essential about human nature. Love doesn't negate internal limits. Loving doesn't mean having the structure to sustain everything all the time. When someone leaves, the immediate conclusion is usually moral failure or lack of feeling. But often it's just emotional exhaustion. Love is treated as something infinite, unbreakable, but people aren't. This expectation creates bonds based on resistance, not on health. And when the other person gives in, the one who stays feels betrayed by a promise that could never be fulfilled in that way. The problem isn't love leaving, it's the fantasy that it should never need to go. Love works like a muscle. When trained consciously, it grows, strengthens, and sustains weight. But when it's overloaded, pushed beyond its limits, pressured without pause, it breaks. Not because it's weak, but because it was forced to function without rest. Some relationships become ill precisely there. When love becomes an obligation to remain, when there's no space to breathe, fail, or reorganize. There comes a point when the way out isn't abandonment, it's emotional survival. Resting is also part of growth, even if it hurts the one who stays. Understanding this changes how we interpret the departure, not as a denial of what existed, but as a consequence of a love that was demanded without pause. Not every separation is an absence of feeling. Sometimes, it's the only way to prevent it from completely destroying itself. The pain of absence doesn't come from missing the person, it comes from missing the meaning core idea. The deepest suffering isn't caused by the absence of the person itself, but by the sudden collapse of the emotional routine that gave structure to your days. When someone leaves, what really disappears isn't just their body or their voice. It's the invisible system you built around them. Your mind had a rhythm, your emotions had a schedule, and when that breaks, the pain feels disorienting, almost physical. Analogy: removing an invisible pillar from a house. Imagine a house that looks perfectly normal from the outside. The walls are intact, the roof is still there, nothing appears broken. But inside, there was a single pillar, invisible to anyone who visited, holding everything in balance. Now imagine that pillar is suddenly removed. The house doesn't collapse immediately. Instead, it creaks. Doors no longer close properly. The floor tilts just enough to make you uncomfortable. That's what absence feels like. The person wasn't just someone you loved. They were an emotional pillar. They supported routines, expectations, meanings. When they left, the structure of your inner world lost its balance, even though, from the outside, you're still standing. Personal experience: the emptiness in the small details. What hurts most isn't the big moments. It's the small, almost invisible ones. Reaching for your phone at the same time every day, and realizing there's no message coming. Knowing exactly when you used to talk, laugh, or check in, and suddenly having that hour feel unbearably long. Habits that made no sense on their own, but made perfect sense with them. I remember sitting in silence, not crying, not even thinking about the person directly, just feeling lost in time, like the day had too many empty spaces. The pain wasn't, I miss them. The pain was, I don't know how to exist in this moment anymore. Because absence isn't just about loss, it's about the loss of orientation, and healing doesn't begin when the person comes back. It begins when you slowly build new meaning where the old one used to live. When you beg, you believe you're fighting for love, but what you're really doing is pushing it farther away. Desperation doesn't sound like affection, it sounds like fear, and fear changes the way you're perceived. The more you plead, explain, justify, or promise to change everything, the more the dynamic shifts. Love stops being a choice and starts feeling like pressure. In that moment, the other person isn't moving away because they don't care, but because they feel trapped inside an emotional demand they didn't ask for. Desperation creates imbalance. One person shrinks, the other overwhelms. And the painful truth is that no one moves closer to something that feels like it needs to be escaped. When you beg, you communicate that your stability depends on their decision, and that weight is heavier than most people can carry without running. Love is like sand in your hand. When you hold it gently, it stays. You can feel its texture, its presence, its warmth. But the moment you squeeze too hard, afraid of losing it, it slips through your fingers. Not because the sand wants to leave, but because pressure creates escape. Letting go is not indifference. It's not giving up. It's removing the force that turns connection into suffocation. When you release, you restore balance. You stop chasing and allow choice to exist again. And here's the paradox: most people only understand too late. When you stop pulling, you become safer to approach. Even if they don't come back, you regain something more important: your dignity, your center, your peace. And from that place, whether love returns or not, you are no longer losing yourself trying to be held. The silence that hurts is the same silence that heals, even though it doesn't feel that way at first. On the first day, without sending a message, the body reacts before the mind understands. The hand reaches for the phone automatically, the chest tightens, and every second of quiet feels like rejection. On the fifth day, the pain changes shape. It's no longer panic, it's restlessness. Questions replace urgency. You start replaying conversations, noticing patterns that were invisible when noise filled every gap. The silence begins doing its real work. By the 10th day, something unexpected happens. The absence stops screaming and starts explaining. You realize the silence was never a punishment, never a power move, never cruelty. It was an incubator of clarity. A space where emotions could settle instead of collide. In the quiet, you hear truths that words kept interrupting. What you were tolerating, what you were chasing, what wasn't being met. Silence strips illusion slowly, without force. It hurts because it removes distraction, but it heals because it restores perspective. And at some point, you understand that the silence didn't take something from you. It gave something back. Your center, your self-respect, your ability to see the connection as it was, not as you hoped it would become. Love doesn't come back when you call it, explain it, or try to convince it to stay. It comes back when it recognizes something familiar inside you, something grounded, whole, and no longer begging to be chosen. Return is never the result of persuasion. It's the result of internal alignment. Love works like a magnet. A magnet doesn't chase metal, doesn't argue, doesn't prove its worth. It simply exists in its own integrity, and because of that, attraction happens naturally. When you chase, you break polarity. When you insist, you weaken presence. But when you step back into yourself, when your emotional center stops orbiting someone else's decision, something shifts quietly. Recognition replaces resistance, not because the other person suddenly changes, but because the energy they encounter is no longer desperate, fragmented, or seeking validation. It's stable, and stability is what allows recognition to occur. There's a day that marks the real turning point, and most people don't notice it at first. It's the day you laugh again without forcing it. The day a moment distracts you completely and for a few minutes you forget to wait. That day carries a different emotional frequency. When you stop checking your phone, stop counting days, stop imagining scenarios, your energy changes, even at a distance. Emotional presence is felt beyond words. The moment you genuinely start feeling okay, not pretending, not numbing, but actually okay, something moves. Sometimes it's the other person reaching out. Sometimes it's clarity arriving instead. But something always changes. Because the return was never about being missed. It was about being recognized. And recognition only happens when you are no longer asking to be seen. When you stop waiting, you stop shrinking. And from that place, whether love returns or not, you are no longer abandoned. You are complete. The return is not always physical. Sometimes it happens in awareness. And that distinction changes everything. Many people wait for a body to come back, a message, a knock at the door, believing that only presence can validate what was real. But not every return is a relationship restarting. Some returns arrive as understanding, arriving quietly long after the separation has already reshaped you. There comes a moment when you stop asking, will they come back? And start realizing that what truly needed to return was clarity. The mind finally catches up to the heart. You see the connection without distortion, without longing blurring the truth. And that awareness feels like closure, even if no reunion ever happens. It's like a letter that arrives late. Not in time to change what already happened, not in time to save what was lost, but exactly on time to close the cycle. You open it expecting answers, maybe apologies, maybe explanations, and instead you find understanding. You finally see why things unfolded the way they did, why certain words were never said, why distance became inevitable. The letter doesn't bring the person back into your life, but it releases them from your mind. And that release is powerful, because it means you no longer need them to explain themselves for you to move forward. Some returns come as acceptance, others come as forgiveness, not spoken out loud, but internal and complete. You stop replaying scenarios, stop negotiating with the past, stop hoping for a version of the story that never existed. The return happens when you no longer feel abandoned by the ending, when you understand that what ended did not fail, it fulfilled its purpose. Consciousness replaces expectation, peace replaces waiting. And in that moment you realize something profound. Not every love is meant to stay in your life, but every love that was real leaves you wiser than before. That is a return, not to the person, but to yourself. True love needs space to breathe, even though everything inside you wants to do the opposite. When fear takes over, proximity feels like safety. Being close all the time seems like protection against loss. But excessive closeness slowly turns into pressure, and pressure suffocates what it's trying to save. There is a moment when love stops flowing naturally and starts being monitored, questioned, checked, and managed. Not because there is no feeling, but because there is too much fear attached to it. And fear changes behavior. It turns affection into vigilance and care into control. The relationship doesn't collapse in a dramatic way. It weakens quietly, through small tensions, unspoken discomforts, and the growing need for distance that no one knows how to ask for without hurting the other. Love works like a plant. Water is essential, but too much water rots the roots. Not because the plant rejects care, but because excess removes oxygen from the soil. Roots need air to grow strong. Relationships are the same. When there is no space to miss, no room to breathe, no silence to reset emotions, love loses its vitality. It becomes heavy, dependent, and fragile. People don't pull away because they stopped loving. They pull away because they can't breathe inside the connection anymore. Space is not absence, it's maintenance. It's what allows desire to renew itself and individuality to survive. When love is given room, it stretches instead of breaks. And when space is respected, closeness becomes a choice again, not an obligation. True love doesn't demand constant presence to exist. It trusts that what is real doesn't disappear when it's allowed to breathe. When he comes back, you're no longer the same person who watched him leave. Pain doesn't just pass through you, it reorganizes you. In the beginning, the loss feels like a collapse, as if something essential was taken and nothing meaningful could grow in its place. But time does something subtle and irreversible. While days move forward, something inside you is quietly being rebuilt. You start noticing changes you didn't plan. Your reactions slow down. Your tolerance for confusion decreases. The questions that once kept you awake begin to lose urgency. What hurt you before no longer has the same power. Not because it stopped mattering, but because you learned how to carry it differently. The version of you that begged for reassurance doesn't exist anymore. Pain carved space where dependence used to live, and in that space, awareness took root. With awareness come new limits, not walls built out of fear, but boundaries shaped by understanding. You no longer confuse intensity with connection or absence with mystery. You see patterns where you once saw hope. When he returns, if he does, he doesn't meet the same open wound he left behind. He meets someone who has learned to stand without constant explanation, without needing to be chosen to feel whole. Your vision is different now. You recognize effort, consistency, and presence with clarity. You're not hardened, you're precise. Pain didn't make you colder, it made you honest with yourself. And that's the quiet shift that changes everything. When someone comes back after you've transformed, The question is no longer, will he stay? It becomes, does this fit the person I've become? Because the pain already did its work, and it didn't leave you empty. It left you changed. There is a risk few people talk about, because it hides behind hope, accepting someone back before healing what broke you the first time. When the return happens, it feels like relief, like proof that the pain had meaning, like validation that you were never wrong for waiting. But restarting without healing doesn't create a new story. It replays the old ending with different expectations. The wounds that were ignored don't disappear just because the person came back. They stay quiet at first, buried under excitement, affection, and the illusion of a fresh start. Yet unhealed pain doesn't fade with presence. It waits. And when the first conflict appears, it resurfaces stronger, carrying all the weight of what was never resolved. Reconnection without inner repair turns love into a fragile agreement, dependent on silence rather than understanding. It's like rebuilding a beautiful house on a cracked foundation. The walls may look new, the furniture may change, the colors may be brighter, but the structure underneath remains unstable. Every step inside that house carries tension, even if no one names it. Small arguments feel heavier. Simple misunderstandings feel threatening. Trust feels conditional, not natural. The relationship demands constant reassurance because the base was never reinforced. Healing is the foundation most people try to skip, not because it's unnecessary, but because it's uncomfortable. Healing requires facing why it ended, what was tolerated, what was ignored, and what cannot repeat. Without that work, love becomes an attempt to outrun history instead of learning from it. True reconciliation isn't about returning quickly, it's about returning differently. Healing creates space for boundaries, clarity, and choice. It allows love to stand without fear of collapse. Without it, the return isn't a second chance. It's the same story restarting from the same fracture. And the risk isn't losing the person again. The real risk is losing yourself by pretending that time alone fixes what only awareness can repair. Sometimes love doesn't return to stay, to rebuild, or to continue the story where it stopped. Sometimes love comes back with a quieter purpose, to release what was left unfinished. When someone reappears after time, distance, and silence, the mind rushes to interpret it as a second chance, a sign that the bond survived everything. But this return often carries a different role. It arrives not to reopen promises but to expose truths that were avoided. The conversations feel different, the pauses last longer, and the emotions no longer fit the old shape. What once felt like home now feels like a room you've outgrown, and that discomfort is not a failure of love, it's evidence of growth. The return highlights what changed, what healed, and what can no longer be sustained. It shows that the connection existed for a reason, but not forever. In this moment, love stops being about holding on and starts being about understanding. Understanding that some people come back only to show you that you are finally ready to let go, without anger, without drama, without unfinished sentences echoing in your chest. Closure rarely looks like a dramatic goodbye. More often it looks like clarity. A simple exchange, a calm realization, a subtle sense that the chapter has already ended. When love returns only to liberate, it removes the illusion that something is still missing. The questions lose their power, the memories soften, and the emotional weight begins to dissolve. What once trapped your thoughts now becomes a lesson you can carry without pain. This kind of ending doesn't erase the past, it reframes it. It allows you to keep what was real while releasing what no longer belongs to your future. The return serves as a mirror, reflecting how far you've come since the separation. And in that reflection, you recognize that the bond did its job. It taught, shaped, revealed, and then stepped aside. Love in this form is not possession or permanence. It is timing. And when the timing passes, the most loving act is not to restart the story, but to close it with awareness, gratitude, and freedom. Finally free to move forward without carrying someone who was only meant to walk with you for a season. There comes a moment that doesn't announce itself with drama, tears, or final words. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, when you stop reaching for what once consumed you. Not because you became cold, but because you became complete. This is the moment when you understand that needing less does not mean losing, it means reclaiming control. Emotional attachment often disguises itself as love, purpose, or loyalty, but beneath it lives a silent dependence. The belief that something outside of you is responsible for your stability. When that belief dissolves, something shifts internally. You no longer negotiate your worth through presence or absence. You stop measuring your value by responses, returns, or recognition. Detachment is not abandonment. It is the act of removing emotional weight from places where it no longer belongs. And the instant you do that, the power dynamic changes. You are no longer waiting. You are standing. When you no longer need, you begin to choose. And choice is where emotional power lives. Needing creates urgency. Urgency creates fear, and fear creates submission. Detachment breaks this chain. It allows you to observe instead of react, to listen instead of chase, to stay grounded while others move unpredictably. This is not about indifference. It is about internal stability. When your peace no longer depends on outcomes, people, or validation, you become emotionally untouchable. Expectations lose their grip. Anxiety loses its fuel. You stop trying to control what you cannot and start mastering what you can. Your responses, your boundaries, your energy. At this stage, you are no longer pulled by loss or seduced by promises. You are centered, and that center becomes your anchor in every interaction. Ironically, this is when life opens its doors, because what you release no longer controls you, and what no longer controls you can finally come closer without power over you. When you don't need approval, it finds you. When you don't chase connection, it aligns naturally. When you stop fearing loss, you become capable of receiving without desperation. This is the paradox. The moment you understand you can walk away is the moment you no longer have to. Detachment does not remove possibilities, it filters them. It ensures that whatever stays does so by alignment, not obligation. And in that space, you don't just have more options. You have clarity, you have strength, you have yourself. Love that leaves and later returns is never the same, not because time damages it, but because distance reveals what routine was hiding. When someone goes, they don't just take their presence, they take the structure that made the relationship feel stable. The messages that arrived at the same hour, the shared silence, the unspoken certainty of tomorrow. Absence removes the emotional autopilot and forces both sides to confront what was real and what was merely familiar. That space acts like a mirror with no filters. Weak intentions become obvious. Unspoken resentments gain weight. And whatever survives that distance does so because it learned to stand without leaning. That's why love that comes back cannot fit into its old shape. It has seen what happens when comfort disappears, and it either rebuilds with awareness or collapses under truth. When it returns better, it's because it learned responsibility. When it doesn't, it's because it was never meant to return at all. When love comes back healed, it no longer relies on promises made in moments of fear. It arrives with boundaries, clarity, and a deeper understanding of loss. It knows what silence costs. It understands that presence is not guaranteed, only chosen. This version doesn't repeat old patterns because it remembers where they led. It doesn't rush reconnection, it respects repair. But when love comes back unchanged, it carries the same cracks disguised as hope. It asks for another chance without offering transformation. And that kind of return isn't romantic, it's repetitive. The difference is simple, but unforgiving. Either love evolves through separation, or separation was its final lesson. That's why love that goes and comes back should never be the same. Because sameness means nothing was learned. And a love that learns becomes stronger, clearer, and more honest than it ever was before. The greatest proof of love is not holding tighter when everything inside you is falling apart. It is knowing when to loosen your grip without letting yourself disappear in the process. Many people confuse love with endurance, sacrifice with destruction, and loyalty with self-erasure. But love was never meant to demand your collapse as payment. When someone truly loves you, they don't require you to shrink, to silence your needs, or to fracture your identity just to stay. And when you break yourself trying to keep someone, what you're really doing is teaching your heart that it only deserves connection through pain. Who loves you does not break you, and who breaks themselves to love gets lost. This truth is uncomfortable because it exposes a pattern many live without naming, staying not because it's healthy, but because leaving feels like failure. Yet love that costs your sense of self is not devotion, it's abandonment turned inward. Loving without losing yourself means recognizing that connection should add weight to your life, not drain it, and that presence should feel grounding, not suffocating. Letting go does not always mean walking away from someone forever. Sometimes it means releasing the version of yourself that believed love had to hurt to be real. It means understanding that you can care deeply and still choose boundaries, that you can miss someone and still protect your integrity. True love does not demand that you disappear to prove your commitment. It asks that you remain whole. When you let someone go without losing yourself, you are not choosing pride over love. You are choosing truth over fear. You are refusing to trade your identity for attachment. And in doing so, you redefine love as something that coexists with self-respect, not something that destroys it. Because the deepest form of love is not staying at any cost, but knowing your worth enough to never abandon yourself again, even when your heart is involved. He left, and at the time it felt like the ground gave way beneath your feet, like life quietly removed a piece you depended on to stand. You didn't choose that moment. You didn't prepare for it, and you didn't understand it when it happened. But you stayed. You breathed through days that felt endless. You rebuilt routines that once revolved around someone else, and you learned how to carry silence without collapsing under its weight. You survived what you once believed would destroy you, and in that survival, something subtle changed. You grew. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. You learned what it means to endure without losing your core, to feel pain without surrendering your future to it. And that alone is already a victory. Because if he came back, let it be by choice, not by need, not by fear, not by the version of you that was willing to disappear just to keep someone close. And if he didn't come back, then let this be the final truth you carry forward. Never return to the person you had to lose yourself to be loved. Tell me, where in the world are you watching this story from? If this video spoke to you, if any part of this story felt like it was describing a chapter of your own life, leave a comment saying, "I survived." Not as a slogan, not as performance, but as a quiet acknowledgement that you made it through something that almost changed who you were. Share this video with someone who is still trying to understand a goodbye, someone who feels stuck between what was and what will never be again, someone who needs to hear that surviving is already progress. And subscribe to the channel for more stories that don't romanticize pain, that don't promise false endings, but speak honestly about loss, growth, and rebuilding without illusions. Because some content distracts you from the truth, and some content helps you face it. This space exists for the second kind,